Welcome to 2018, the Fall Dyslexia Summit. Our guest today is Debbie Abraham. Debbie has been working in the dyslexia field for over 12 years. She's a dyslexia specialist who works mainly with children ages from 5 through 16, developing their reading, spelling, and writing skills. In her consultancy practice, she also works with schools and parents. Welcome, Debbie. Thank you for being on the summit.
Oh, thank you very much for asking me. It's a pleasure.
So you're joining us from the UK.
Yes, and it's actually very sunny and lovely bright blue sky today. That won't last.
Well, that is great. We have rain here, unfortunately. So, well, again, thank you for being on the summit. So I would like to maybe start our discussions at a high level of what is dyslexia, and what are why do dyslexics have a difficulty reading and writing?
Okay, so dyslexia is a language problem, and dyslexics also have an issue with a weak working memory. So under some of the latest research at the moment, which I try and keep up to date with, it's saying that they don't process the natural rhythm of language in the same way as other people do. And this causes them to not hear the sounds in words in the same way that non-dyslexics hear them. So you can see that this has a bit of a knock-on effect to being able to learn things like phonics. In the UK, when children start school, we teach them phonics to help them decode words. I don't know if they do that in the US, but that's what happens in the UK. So many of these children really struggle to pick up phonics because they can't hear the sounds in quite the same way. I also said it's a working memory issue. They have working memory issues, and working memory is your ability to juggle different brain processes at the same time. So if you can only, comfortably juggle 3 to 4 processes, you can see that you're going to have much harder time learning to spell, when also your brain is having to think about, the shape of letters you want to do, what the word sounds like, what letters go with those sounds. There's a whole lot of things that are going on in the background in your brain. So our dyslexics not only have this issue with processing sound, but also an issue with being able to juggle many processes at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So, for those who are wondering, what are the signs of dyslexia? There are a lot of parents and even teachers who have new students every year. What should they be watching out for when they have a student that is struggling with reading? Because not every struggling reader is not dyslexic, but there are some specific signs that really separate a dyslexic child from the rest.
Yeah, and of course it's got to be remembered that not every dyslexic person actually struggles with reading, particularly early on, and we can talk about that a bit later on if you want to. But the earliest sort of big warning bell that should be ringing very firmly in every parent's head is if anybody else in the family has ever been assessed as having dyslexia or has ever had trouble picking up reading, spelling and writing. Because obviously if we go back a generation or so, they probably wouldn't have been assessed as being dyslexic, but you might be aware that your father or your grandfather had difficulties in, or your grandmother, of course, might have had difficulties in learning to read and write and spell. So really, it's not really so much a sign in the child, it's a sign in the family. We know it runs in families. So if it is in your family, you should keep a very, very close eye on what's going on. If your child has any speech and language problems, even to the point if they can't say multi-syllable words correctly, so they might mix up the sounds. So instead of saying perhaps like spaghetti, they might say spaghetti. I can't even mix them up, to be honest, but like tapsetti or something. They'll say something, and when they're quite young, you might think, oh, that's quite sweet. They can't quite say that word properly. But if it persists, and every time you correct them, they still can't say a longer word correctly, then actually that can be quite an early sign of dyslexia. Not being able to understand rhyme or being able to make a rhyming word is also one of the earliest signs. It's simply because they're not really hearing and processing sound, and you can kind of see that they're not going to know when words actually rhyme, or what it is that they're actually listening for that makes a word rhyme. And of course, once they start school, say in the UK, one of our sort of earliest indicators is that they have to take a phonics test. I think it's at the end of year 1, and quite often our dyslexic students will fail the test because they simply can't pick it up that fast. So that's another quite big indicator. If your child has ever failed any kind of phonic test or phonics screening, they're quite likely to be dyslexic or possibly dyslexic.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. You work with families and you work with schools, and if the child is diagnosed with a reading um, disability or dyslexia, if they're specifically specifying it in the diagnosis, so how can the parents support their children, and how can schools support their children, and how can they, more importantly, work together to give the best accommodations to the students?
So it's really important for schools to try and identify which skill the child is missing. So, for example, if we look at reading, we know that for a child to be able to read, they've got to be able to recognise the letter shapes. They've got to know what sounds go with those letters. They've got to move on and know the sounds that when you have 2 vowels together, what sounds they make, as well as the individual letter sounds. We know that you have to be able to automatically recall those letters and sounds. And we know that you have to be able to discriminate the spoken sounds in spoken language. So, for example, in the word sheep, the child has to be able to know that it starts with a sh, the middle sound is an e, and at the end sound is a p. And if any of those skills are actually missing, then that child is not going to be able to become a fluent reader. So really, that's where all schools and maybe parents as well need to start. Which skills are missing? And then you need to teach the children specifically those particular skills. So if they're not discriminating sounds in spoken words, you need to spend some time teaching them how to do that. If they don't know which sounds and letters go together, then you've got to spend time specifically teaching that. There's no point in teaching phonics until a child can hear each individual sound in a word. You'd be wasting your time. If they can't hear the sounds, they're not going to learn phonics. But all dyslexics can learn this. It's just you have to explicitly teach it. So that's kind of like a fairly academic thing. But of course, we know that our dyslexic children struggle with more than just reading and spelling and writing. They struggle with things like organisation. They lose a lot of things. You know, it's not unusual for them to come home without half the PE kit or whatever it is. So it's maybe, setting up structures at home to help them become more organised, whether you have colour-coded drawers for each day of the week, and they put in the drawer what they need that day to take out. So, there's the sort of the softer skills. And I think as well, we can become really focused on the academic side. But of course, when our children are struggling in school, they often lose self-esteem and self-confidence. And again, this is where families can really help their children, make sure they have a balance in their life, make sure they're going out and they're doing things they really enjoy and that they're really good at, so that they're not always, concentrating on things that they're weak at. They're not always failing at everything. You're teaching them they can be good at other things. So I think with the dyslexics, it's quite complicated, isn't it? You've kind of got the academic side that you need to address, and on that side, it's all about putting in the skills, the underlying skills they don't have, and then you've got the the more sort of independent type skills, which they need help to develop, the organisation, and then you have the developing them as a whole person and making sure that they're doing the things they enjoy.
Well, that is it's very important to make sure that the students and the children are happy as as children, and they grow up to be confident adults. And it all starts, I think, with really understanding what their strengths are and balancing their academic challenges with their strengths.
Yes, definitely.
So we talk about reading a lot with dyslexia, but can you also touch a little bit on writing? So,
yeah, sure.
How is writing affected, and how can we support improvements in writing?
Okay, so if we split writing maybe down into two bits, so we've got spelling and then we've got writing. So we'll maybe look at spelling first. So the issues with spelling are kind of similar. It's the other side of the coin to reading, really. So it's a similar thing. To be able to spell well, you've got to, again, know what sounds are in the words. You've got to be able to split the words down into their individual sounds. You also need to know when a word looks right, because obviously English and American English being the same, and I'm sure it's the same for Australian English, some of the words are not that regular. I'm thinking of words like yacht. You can't possibly sound that out with Y-A-C-H-T, like whoever came up with that. So you've got to be able to use a sort of a sound strategy quite well, but you also need a visual strategy, knowing when a word looks right, knowing also like the structure of language. So all of these things, the dyslexic student will struggle with some part of that, whether they struggle with the sound, or they may spell very phonetically right, but of course it doesn't look right because English being English, it doesn't necessarily follow the rules, or they might not really understand the structure of language. They don't necessarily understand when they're using prefixes, root words and suffixes. So that's sort of some of the problems with spelling. Then you've got an issue with writing. Most of that comes down to working memory. When you're coming up with a piece of writing, you're actually putting quite a heavy load on your working memory. So often these students have difficulty getting their ideas down on paper. They can tell you, like wonderful things perhaps about what they've done at the weekend, and then you ask them to write it down and you might be lucky to get 2 sentences in sort of 25 minutes. And what you're seeing there really is more of a working memory issue. Their brain is being overloaded, being asked to do too many things at once, and therefore you don't tend to see in their written work, it doesn't kind of reflect their verbal intellectual abilities really. So that's kind of what we see. And of course, when they do a longer piece of writing, even if they can spell some of those words when you're doing a one-word spelling test, it might go out the window completely in a longer piece of writing. And again, it's a working memory issue. So important things are to teach the children how to overcome that, what they can do to make sure that the piece of work they produce is the best piece possible. Do you want me to outline a little bit about that?
That would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So with working memory, the whole thing is chunking down processes. The more you chunk a process down, the more that a dyslexic can get things down on paper to the best of their ability. So, for example, they might need to brainstorm words first that they want to use, plan out the piece of writing. Planning can take, you could do like mind maps. Do you call them mind maps in the US, or spider diagrams?
Yes.
They could also record their ideas into a smartphone. anything to kind of like, get some of their initial thoughts down before trying to form proper sentences. So planning is a really important stage. Then from their plan, they can make it more intricate, so that basically when they come to write the piece, they're not writing any of it from memory. They're looking at a piece of paper that's already got all of their ideas down. It's already got words down. It might have phrases on there. You can make the plan quite detailed. And then, of course, they then do the piece of writing. But proofreading and editing is also a really key part of the writing process. I mean, actually for any of us, but even more so probably for a dyslexic student, because things that you'll typically find is there'll be no punctuation in there. Capital letters, won't necessarily exist. And it's all those things that you can put back in or put in when you're proofreading and editing. Any words that they know they spell incorrectly all the time. I mean, I have some students who just know that, they can't spell the word who. So every time they come across it, they double check they've got those letters in the right order. And also just one proofread through, just simply for spelling, to see how many of their spelling errors that they can pick up themselves. And it can be surprising how much they can pick up, actually. I would say most of my students pick up 75 to 80% of their spelling errors through a proofreading, editing stage.
I love the English language. I speak a few languages, and
Right.
I feel like English is the wildest of all.
Yeah.
I am learning the rules behind it, but still,
Yes.
it doesn't make sense to me as a foreigner, as a non-native speaker.
Yeah.
And I always chuckle.
Doesn't make much sense to us.
And that's what most of my native speaking friends say as well. And I see the word put, P-U-T, and then you change the let B to B, P to B, and it becomes but. Like, how do you explain
Yes.
it?
I
don't know.
I don't know. A lot of it, to be honest, the problem with English is that it's evolved over the years. It's not a very pure language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, England itself, we've been invaded so many times in history that we've got words from all over the place. Some of the really odd spellings, like the ones for would and could, I think come from the Vikings. I might be corrected on that. We've got Latin words, we've got Greek words, we've got French words, and it's like someone's just sort of done, like, whooshed them all up, and some of it's Old English. It's a language that's evolved so much over the last sort of 1,000 years, and that's half the problem. It's why some of it is so irregular. It's not really English. It's words that have been thrown in from all sorts of other languages. So it's a mess, isn't it?
Yeah. I wish I had one that I could just puff and all the right sounds would go to the right places and the whole dictionary would be revised.
Yes, yeah. I think we all need to, isn't I think Italian and German and French to some extent are very clear, aren't they? They're sort of very much sound and letters map completely onto each other. So I think we all need to start speaking Italian or something.
Yeah. So it's one thing to teach the children, the dyslexic students the way to read and write, but it's another thing for them to retain this information in the long run. As you mentioned, sometimes they learn the rules, but in a few days the information is not there, or it has to be retold. So do you have any advice for teachers,
Yeah.
tutors, and parents on how to get this information really to stick?
Yeah, so again, it's working memory is the culprit again for this one. Working memory, I like to think of it as like a drawer. It's the drawer that goes into your long-term memory, both open and shut. So it's the way that a student takes in information and sticks it in their long-term memory, and it's also the drawer that enables them to retrieve it out of their long-term memory to be able to use it. Both things are a bit of an issue, aren't they? But yeah, definitely retaining. Research points to something called spaced learning to help students retain it. And what it basically means, so let's say take spellings as a fairly easy example. So if you want to learn how to spell the word would, as in like I would like to go to the shops, then you would let the student look at it on sort of days 1, 2, 3 and 4, and whatever strategy you're using, it might be like a look, cover, write, check type of strategy. So they would use that for 4 days, and then the next day you wouldn't let them look at it, but you say, well, how do you spell would? And if they get it right, you leave it 24 hours. Then you ask them again, how do you spell would? If they can still do it, you leave it for 2 days. Bear in mind, you're not letting them look at it again before you're asking. After 2 days, you ask them again, how do you spell would? They're still getting it right. Leave it 5 days, ask again, leave it 2 weeks. If they can still spell it correctly after 2 weeks, then it's deemed to be learnt and in long-term memory. If they trip up along the way, so if they maybe know it after 2 days and then forget it after a week, you go right back to the start, 4 days in a row, let them look at it, whatever strategy, perhaps change the strategy if perhaps it hasn't worked, do it again on the trot for 4 days, and then start the whole process again. And this is really important for revision for a lot of dyslexic students. They just can't start revising, a month before important exams. They really need to be reviewing the information they've learned often, preferably at the end of the day they've learnt it. Maybe look at it again the next day, look over it again after a week, look over it again after a month. So you're kind of keeping it fairly fresh, and in that way you've got more chances of it going into your long-term memory. And of course what I'm describing is quite onerous, isn't it? But it does work. And if you do this spaced learning, then things will go in and they will be learnt and retained. But it takes a lot of motivation and support, I think, for them to be able to achieve it.
Yeah, you're right. It takes a long process, but as we know,
Yeah,
memory to get it from where it is to long-term memory, where it really sticks. It's also repetition that is really needed, and it has to be the right type of repetition.
absolutely. Yeah, no, and if you can get your school on board, so that the child is repeating things very often, then that's a key way to get it into long-term memory.
Yes, that's true. So before we tell our viewers where they can find you, maybe we can talk about how you got into the field, and what's your emotional relationship with dyslexia.
So it goes back quite a few years actually to when I was about 17. I was dating somebody at that time who was dyslexic, and obviously when you're 17 you don't really know very much about it. But one thing that struck me was that he'd left school without very many qualifications, and yet he was a really intelligent person, but struggling out in the world due to the lack of qualifications, really. So fast forward on probably something like 10 years, and I started to train to be a teacher. And it struck me then that was a field I wanted to know much more about, because I wanted to know why he had obviously struggled and not achieved really what he should have done from sort of his verbal and intellectual abilities. He should have done so much better than he did. So it always stayed, and I took every kind of module I could on dyslexia, because I think in the US it's the same as the UK. Bizarrely, you don't actually have to do anything on dyslexia when you do your qualifications. However, I did the opposite. I did every single solitary one that I could. Started teaching these people. Still realised that I couldn't help them in the ways that I wanted to, there was still something, I always felt there's something I just didn't really understand. So I then did a master's qualification, which really, I think it's only at that level that I felt like I started to have an understanding of what dyslexia was, and how I could actually help people. And now I sort of follow certain researchers to keep myself up to date, because this field changes quite a lot, quite often, and things that we sort of thought perhaps were important, it all kind of changes, doesn't it? And then the thoughts behind it. So I kind of like keep myself up to date now, and I finally feel like I'm actually in a place where I can help students to be successful, and take, either like non-readers or very struggling readers, and get them up to a point where they're reading at a good level, where they're going to get there. In the UK, we call them GCSEs, the exams they take at 16. And that, to me, that's what it's all about. You want them to be able to get that standard education, so that they can then go on and, of course, specialise in whatever they want to do. And if they want to, they can go on and get their degrees or their masters. That there's no barriers to them, and that's kind of really what keeps me going. So even when I'm at primary, teaching my primary school children, I've always got it in mind, sort of, going forward, that what they need to do to be able to get their qualifications at 16, so they can do them whatever they want to do, and get to college and university, etc.
That's a beautiful idea, and I hope to reach all around the world. Hopefully one day all programs that certification programs that teachers have to take will have dyslexia as part of their curriculum, because it's a lot of
Yeah.
in the classroom that are affected by it. And the more I learn about all the different systems that are used out there, it seems like it's not only the dyslexic children, but also other children who are on different spectrums, or just struggling readers who are not really dyslexic could benefit from
Oh,
this.
yeah, definitely. I mean, we know from 30 years worth of research what skills children need to be able to read. And whether you want to, whether they're dyslexic, or, as you say, they're struggling, or they're on they've got some other learning issue, or maybe they're on the autistic spectrum, whatever it is, we still know what skills they have to develop to become a good reader. And it's more about the how you get them there. That's the interesting bit, really. And that's where we come in as teachers. If one way isn't working, well, then you do it a different way, in my opinion. But we know what they need to do, so we need to get them there.
The one thing you mentioned was that not every dyslexic is a struggling reader, and we could touch base on that a bit later. So maybe you can explain that to us.
Yeah, sure. So some dyslexics have a very, very strong visual memory, which means that it's a bit like having a photographic memory. So once they start to learn certain words, they fix it as a picture in their heads. Now, you find this particularly when they first start school, and it can carry them all the way through their schooling up to about the age of 11, if you're not careful. And they seem to be quite good readers, because obviously they've made a picture of the word, they can recall it, so they're reading quite well. But the problem is that when they go to high school, sort of secondary school in the UK, so from the ages of 11 to 16, they're suddenly having to learn a lot more about individual subjects. So, they're taking biology separately, and chemistry and physics and geography, history. They're suddenly having to read a lot more, and a lot more in-depth words, a lot more subject-specific words that they've never seen before. And if you're just making a kind of a photographic memory of words, but if you've never seen the word before, you've got no way into it. You don't know what it says. So that's when children are then often assessed as being dyslexic, because they suddenly start to struggle, or it seems like they suddenly start to struggle. And it's just because they've got very strong visual memories, they've made all these pictures of all this vocabulary, simple vocabulary, which they can get away with perhaps up until they're 11. Maybe 8 or 9 is another key age where this starts to get picked up. And then, of course, they can't split words up into sounds. They don't know which sounds and letters go together. So they can't decode harder words, and they start to struggle. And people often can't understand that because it seems like they've picked up reading quite well, but they probably failed a phonics test along the way. But if they're reading, then teachers might go, oh yeah, but they're reading, so it's fine, it doesn't matter. And it's like, well, no, actually it does matter. If they failed that but you still think they're okay to read, it's showing that there is a problem, and it is going to come back to bite them at some point. So it's not every dyslexic student, clearly. I find the ones the schools pick up the fastest are the ones who fail to pick up reading. But there is this other little cohort, quite a significant cohort of children who will pick up reading initially and then they struggle later on, and that's why.
So the alarming signs would be they would be failing the phonics text even though they can read.
Yes.
And probably nonsense words would be very difficult for them.
They wouldn't be able to read those. Yeah, definitely.
So if they're at ages 9 and 10 and they can read, but they can't read nonsense words, and that would be a good way to say they're reading from memory, not really understanding the sounds.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Well, that's a great tip, I think, because I do know quite a few parents do say that we don't understand how our child can have dyslexia because they actually can read. Even chapter books.
Yes.
Lots of children do memorize, chapter books with just a few mistakes here and there. They can really recite the books, and as you said, as they get older, suddenly they hit the wall, and they say it can't be dyslexia because my child is able to read.
Yeah, it's the trouble with thinking that dyslexia is a reading issue. It's not. It's a language issue. And I think if we can get that away from everyone thinking it's a reading issue, then people will be more open to thinking about it. If they find that their child initially starts off quite well and then, as you say, hits a wall later on. If you think it's a reading issue, then you're not going to think your child has or is dyslexic, and you're not going to get them the right help to enable them to progress, especially in their sort of higher levels of education, where they need both a sort of a visual approach and a sound approach to be able to tackle reading, particularly subject specific vocabulary that they're going to start to come across a lot more.
I think that will be my biggest takeaway from this interview, is that dyslexia is not just a reading issue, it's actually a language issue.
Yeah.
And I'll think a lot more about this as I move on with the summit and other things I do. I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yes, it's a language issue which can affect reading, will most likely always affect spelling. So that's a better way of thinking about it.
So for our viewers who want to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
So I have a website which is under www.dyslexiadeb.co.uk. I'm also on Facebook under Dyslexia Deb. I have a Facebook group on there as well, which you're all very welcome to come and join. We're a very supportive group. It's free. I go in there a couple of times every day. People asking advice, and I like to think that we give out good advice. You can end up with so much conflicting advice, I think, especially if you start Googling on the internet and things. Come to us and we'll cut through it all for you and sort of point you all in the right direction.
And I'll put all below for the social media as well as your website.
Lovely, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us today. It was lovely having you.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.